Sometimes an avoidant does not end things in a clear way. There is no final conversation, no honest goodbye, no closure that makes sense. They simply start disappearing while still being present. Messages become shorter, effort becomes weaker, emotion slowly fades from their presence, and the connection you once felt begins to feel like you are the only one still holding it together. This is where most people get trapped. They keep looking for a moment that explains the change. They wait for a clear sign that says it is over. But avoidant behavior does not always work that way. It does not always end with words. It ends with distance. Small, quiet distance that builds over time until it becomes the new normal. And by the time it becomes obvious, the emotional shift has already happened long before the physical one. This is the part most people miss. They react too late because they are still holding on to how things used to be, not how things have become. In this video, a deeper pattern will be revealed. Not just surface-level behavior, but the emotional structure behind it. The signs that show when an avoidant partner is no longer emotionally invested. The subtle changes that most people ignore. The shift in communication, attention, effort, and emotional availability that slowly signals withdrawal. Each point in this video is designed to help bring clarity where confusion usually takes over. There will be no vague explanations, only clear behavioral patterns that repeat in avoidant dynamics across relationships. These are the signs that often appear long before someone officially steps away. By the end of this video, there will be a clearer understanding of what emotional withdrawal actually looks like in real time. Not just in theory, but in the way it shows up in daily interactions, in conversations, and in the energy between two people. There will also be insight into why avoidants tend to distance themselves instead of expressing directly, and why this creates so much confusion for the other person involved. This is not about blaming anyone. It is about understanding patterns that are often misunderstood. Because once these patterns are clear, it becomes easier to see reality without overthinking or self-doubt. It becomes easier to stop chasing mixed signals and start recognizing emotional truth. There is a reason this topic matters. Many people stay stuck in one-sided emotional effort without realizing when the connection has already shifted. They keep investing time, energy, and emotion into something that is no longer being matched. Not because they do not care about themselves, but because the signs were never understood early enough. This video will break down those signs step by step. It will show how emotional distance develops, how communication changes, how effort disappears, and how presence without connection becomes the new pattern. These are not random behaviors. They are part of a consistent emotional withdrawal process. Pay close attention to each sign, because the smallest changes often reveal the biggest truths. Missing those details is what keeps people emotionally attached long after the connection has already weakened. And once these signs are fully understood, it becomes much harder to be misled by silence, inconsistency, or emotional confusion. Welcome to the channel. This space is dedicated to deep psychological insights about relationships, emotional patterns, and human behavior. If this is your first time here, subscribe and stay connected for more videos that bring clarity to complex emotional situations. Avoidant behavior often creates confusion because it does not follow direct emotional expression. Instead of clearly communicating what they feel, avoidants tend to hold things inside and manage emotions on their own. Open emotional conversations can feel overwhelming for them, especially when situations become intense or require vulnerability. As a result, they often step back instead of leaning in. When emotional pressure increases, their natural response is to create space. Not always physical space, but emotional distance. They may respond less, share less, and slowly reduce their level of engagement in the connection. This shift does not always come with explanation. It happens quietly, making it difficult for the other person to understand what is changing. When interest begins to fade, avoidants rarely communicate it in a direct way. They do not usually say that they are pulling away or losing emotional connection. Instead, their behavior starts to change. Conversations lose depth, effort becomes inconsistent. The emotional warmth that once existed starts to disappear in small stages rather than one sudden moment. This gradual withdrawal is often what leads to misunderstanding. The other person continues to look for emotional clarity through words, while the avoidant is already expressing their shift through behavior. The gap between what is said and what is shown becomes wider over time, creating confusion and overthinking. Silence becomes more common, replies take longer, initiation decreases. Even when communication still exists, it feels less engaging and less emotionally present. These changes are subtle at first, which is why they are often ignored or explained away as temporary situations or external stress. This is where many people stay stuck emotionally. They focus on maintaining connection while missing the shift happening in behavior. The lack of direct communication makes it difficult to recognize that emotional investment has already started to decrease. Communication is often the first place where emotional change becomes visible. When an avoidant begins to detach, their way of responding starts to shift in a noticeable but subtle way. Messages that once carried interest, warmth, or curiosity slowly turn into short and direct replies. There is no longer effort to expand the conversation or keep it flowing naturally. Questions become rare. Instead of asking about the other person's day, feelings, or thoughts, responses start to end the conversation rather than continue it. Even when the topic is simple, there is no emotional engagement behind the words. The tone feels flat, as if the conversation is being managed rather than enjoyed. This change does not usually happen suddenly. It develops over time. At first, it may seem like a temporary phase or distraction, but gradually, the difference becomes clearer. The energy that once made communication feel easy starts to disappear. What used to feel natural now feels forced. There is also a lack of emotional expression in the way they communicate. Even positive or casual conversations lose their depth. Messages become functional instead of emotional. There is no curiosity, no playful engagement, and no desire to extend interaction beyond what is necessary. Even simple conversations start to feel like effort for them. Where there was once flow, there is now hesitation. Where there was once engagement, there is now distance. The response is still there, but the connection behind it feels reduced. This is not only about being busy or distracted with life. Many people mistake it for that in the beginning, but the pattern becomes clearer when the emotional tone consistently drops. The communication is still happening, but the emotional presence within it is no longer the same. One of the clearest changes in avoidant behavior appears in who is initiating contact. At the beginning of the connection, there is usually balance. Messages come from both sides. There is effort to check in, to start conversations, and to maintain some level of consistency. It feels mutual, even if not perfectly equal. Over time, this pattern starts to change. The avoidant begins to withdraw from initiating contact. Messages no longer come from their side first. The responsibility of keeping the connection alive slowly shifts onto the other person. What once felt like shared effort becomes one-sided without any clear announcement or explanation. This shift is often subtle at first. It may not be obvious in a single day or even a single week, but when observed over time, the pattern becomes clear. One person is always reaching out, while the other is only responding. The natural flow of connection starts to break. When initiation stops, it reflects more than just a change in communication habits. It shows a change in emotional investment. Avoidants tend to engage where they still feel emotional value or comfort. When that internal sense of value decreases, their motivation to initiate naturally fades. This is where confusion often begins. The responses may still exist, but the effort to start interaction is gone. That creates a false sense of ongoing connection, even when the emotional direction has already shifted. The imbalance becomes more visible as time passes. One person continues to reach out, hoping to maintain closeness. The other no longer feels the same need to bridge the gap. The connection still exists in form, but not in equal participation. What once felt like a shared space slowly turns into a situation where only one person is actively holding it together. Emotional distance can be one of the most confusing signs because presence alone can create a false sense of connection. On the surface, communication still happens. Messages are still replied to. Meetings may still take place. But something important begins to feel different underneath it all. The interaction starts to lose depth. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel flat. There is no real curiosity about the other person's thoughts, experiences, or emotions. Questions become rare or surface level. The natural flow of emotional exchange begins to disappear, even though contact still exists. This creates a strange experience where someone is physically present, but emotionally unavailable. The body is there, the responses are there, but the emotional connection feels absent. It becomes difficult to point out exactly what is wrong because nothing obvious is happening on the surface. Yet the feeling of disconnection is strong. In deeper interactions, emotional presence is what builds closeness. When that presence fades, conversations lose meaning. Even simple discussions start to feel empty. There is no longer a sense of shared emotional space. It feels more like two separate individuals exchanging words rather than truly connecting. This type of distance is often overlooked because it does not look like rejection at first. The communication still continues, which gives the impression that things are fine. But the emotional layer underneath is no longer active. That is where the shift becomes significant. Over time, the lack of emotional engagement becomes more noticeable. One person may try to reconnect emotionally, while the other remains detached in tone and response. The imbalance grows quietly, without direct explanation or acknowledgement. This is why emotional distance is often one of the clearest indicators of internal withdrawal. It shows that while interaction may still exist, the emotional connection that once gave it meaning has already started to fade. Future talk is often one of the most revealing parts of any relationship because it shows whether someone is mentally investing beyond the present moment. When an avoidant starts to disconnect, this is usually where the shift becomes visible. Conversations that once included plans, ideas, or shared intentions begin to fade into the background. There is a noticeable change in how they respond when the future is mentioned. Instead of engaging, they become vague or unresponsive. Topics that involve planning ahead are avoided or redirected. Even simple discussions about upcoming days or events start to feel uncomfortable for them. The focus slowly shifts away from anything that creates emotional or long-term attachment. Commitment-related conversations also begin to disappear. There is less willingness to define direction or build shared expectations. Everything starts to remain open-ended, with no clear emotional or practical investment. The connection begins to feel temporary, even if no direct statement is made. This pattern is not always obvious at first. It can be easy to overlook because daily interaction may still exist. But when someone consistently avoids future-oriented language, it reflects a deeper internal distance. Their mindset is no longer focused on building something together, but rather on keeping things light and unstructured. People who are emotionally invested naturally include others in their future thinking. Even small things like upcoming plans, routines, or ideas reflect connection. When that disappears, it often signals a change in emotional direction. With avoidance, this avoidance of future talk becomes a protective pattern. It allows them to stay present without fully committing emotionally. But for the other person, it creates uncertainty and confusion, especially when past behavior included more openness about shared direction. Over time, the absence of future conversation becomes more noticeable than the presence of current interaction, because it quietly shows where emotional investment has started to fade. One of the most powerful shifts in avoidant behavior appears when your absence no longer creates any visible reaction. At the beginning of a connection, even small gaps in communication usually trigger some form of response. There is curiosity, checking in, or at least awareness when contact reduces. But as emotional withdrawal progresses, that response slowly disappears. They no longer ask where you are or why you have become distant. The natural concern that once existed fades into silence. Even longer periods without communication do not seem to create urgency or emotional discomfort. The space that once felt uncomfortable becomes normal for them. This change can feel confusing because it does not match earlier behavior. There was a time when distance would have been noticed and addressed. Now the same distance is met with indifference or neutrality. It is not always expressed in words, but it is shown through the lack of reaction. When someone is emotionally invested, absence usually creates some form of emotional response. It can be curiosity, concern, or an attempt to reconnect. But when that emotional attachment weakens, absence no longer carries the same weight. The connection begins to feel optional rather than essential. This is where the shift becomes more serious. Silence no longer triggers engagement. Disconnection no longer leads to repair attempts. The emotional system that once kept the bond active is no longer responding in the same way. Even if communication resumes later, the urgency is gone. The energy behind reconnecting feels reduced. It becomes clear that the emotional dependence on the connection has changed significantly. This stage often reflects deeper detachment that has already taken place internally. The interaction may still exist on the surface, but the emotional sensitivity toward your presence or absence is no longer the same as before. When emotional distance increases, one of the clearest changes appears in priorities. Their attention begins to shift away from the connection and moves toward everything else in their life. Work becomes more consuming, friends become more present in their schedule, hobbies, routines, and personal interests suddenly take more space than before. At first, it may look like normal busyness. Life can get demanding, and people do need balance. But the pattern becomes clearer when the emotional connection is no longer receiving the same level of attention or effort. It is not just about having less time, it is about where emotional energy is being directed. The relationship starts to feel less important compared to other parts of their world. Plans get delayed more often, communication becomes less of a priority. Even small efforts to stay connected begin to reduce. The connection slowly moves down their list of attention without any direct explanation. This shift is often driven by emotional comfort. Avoidant individuals tend to move toward situations and people that feel safe and require less emotional exposure. When a connection starts to feel emotionally demanding or overwhelming, their focus naturally shifts away from it. As this happens, other areas of life take over the emotional space that the relationship once held. It is not always a conscious decision. It is a gradual redirection of energy toward what feels easier to manage emotionally. From the outside, it may still look like they are busy or occupied, but the real change is in emotional investment. The effort to maintain connection no longer feels as important as it once did. That is why everything else starts to appear more prioritized. Over time, this creates a noticeable imbalance, where one person is still trying to maintain closeness, while the other has already shifted their emotional focus elsewhere. Repair effort in a connection is one of the strongest signs of emotional investment. In the beginning, even avoidant individuals may try to address misunderstandings in their own way. It might not always be perfect communication, but there is still some level of effort to reduce tension and restore balance after conflict. As emotional withdrawal increases, this behavior starts to change. Misunderstandings are no longer addressed with the same intention. Instead of engaging in resolution, there is a growing tendency to step back. Conversations that could fix issues are avoided or left incomplete. The effort to clear emotional tension begins to fade. Arguments that once received attention or response start to be ignored. Instead of working through problems, silence becomes the default reaction. There is less willingness to engage in emotionally uncomfortable situations, even when those situations are important for the health of the connection. This shift is subtle at first. It may appear as needing space or time to think, but over time, it becomes a pattern. Problems are no longer revisited. Emotional distance replaces discussion. The natural process of repairing misunderstandings slowly disappears from the dynamic. When someone is emotionally invested, they usually try to restore connection after conflict. Even if they need time, there is still a return to address what went wrong. When that return no longer happens, it signals a deeper change in emotional involvement. Avoidants, especially when detached, tend to withdraw from emotional intensity rather than face it directly. Repairing issues requires emotional engagement, vulnerability, and presence, which they may begin to avoid as their interest decreases. Over time, this lack of repair effort creates emotional gaps that remain unclosed. What was once addressed and resolved becomes left behind, adding to the growing distance between both people in the connection. At a certain point in avoidant dynamics, the experience begins to feel like chasing something that is no longer fully present. The connection still exists in memory, but the current reality feels completely different. There is a clear contrast between how things used to feel and how they feel now. Earlier moments are still remembered. The warmth, the attention, and the emotional closeness once made the connection feel alive and stable. But over time, that version slowly fades, replaced by distance, inconsistency, and emotional silence. What remains is only a reflection of what used to be. This is where emotional confusion becomes stronger. The mind starts trying to reconnect the present behavior with the past version of the person. There is a constant search for answers in old memories, trying to understand where things changed. This creates overthinking and mental exhaustion because the present no longer matches the emotional history. Effort begins to increase from one side. More messages are sent, more attention is given, more attempts are made to bring back what once existed, but the response does not match that effort. The connection does not return to its earlier state, no matter how much energy is invested. At this stage, the interaction feels one-sided in a very noticeable way. There is action without reaction, effort without return, and emotional investment without shared presence. The gap between both sides becomes wider with time. The connection continues to exist in memory, where everything still feels familiar and meaningful. But in reality, the present interaction no longer carries the same emotional structure. It feels distant, incomplete, and disconnected from what it once was. This is the stage where the emotional experience starts to feel like chasing something that no longer responds, even though it is still remembered as if it once did. An avoidant does not always end a connection in a direct or obvious way. There is rarely a clear goodbye, no final explanation, no moment that fully confirms it is over. Instead, the shift happens slowly through emotional withdrawal. Step by step, the effort reduces, the warmth fades, the presence becomes less consistent, and without realizing it, the connection starts to lose its emotional foundation. It does not happen in one sudden moment. It happens quietly over time. Small changes in communication, less engagement, reduced emotional response, fewer attempts to stay connected. Each part may seem minor on its own, but together they create distance that grows harder to ignore. The most important truth in this entire pattern is simple. When a relationship starts to feel like constant chasing, it is no longer balanced. One person is holding on while the other is already stepping away emotionally. That imbalance is not temporary. It is a sign that the emotional direction has already changed. At that point, what feels like confusion is often clarity that has not been accepted yet. The connection may still exist in memory, but in reality, the emotional presence that once held it together is no longer the same. Holding on longer in this stage does not restore what has faded. It only deepens emotional exhaustion. The longer the imbalance continues, the more it affects inner peace, self-worth, and emotional stability. Understanding this pattern is not about blame, it is about awareness. It helps bring clarity to situations that often feel unclear and emotionally draining. If this video helped bring understanding to your situation, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that breaks down relationship psychology and emotional behavior in a simple and clear way.